Hello friends, welcome back to Digitalk. In this session, I am going to cover the introduction to data source and some important parameters of the data source from the tuning perspective. Okay, so you can consider this session as a session which is specifically designed for the beginners. Okay, or maybe you are a professional. Okay, you have experience on the WebLogic, and then you are dealing with the data sources on day-to-day basis, but still you will get a lot of important information that you may not aware about this. Okay, in this particular session about the some different parameters of the data source, right? So let me quickly cover what exactly is a data source. So data source is used in WebLogic to create a connection to the database. That means you have an application which need to connect to your database. Okay, so for that we use the data source. So now traditionally, if we talk about the method of connecting to the database that we were using long back, okay, or maybe still today, there are a lot of legacy application that is still using the same way of connecting to the database, that is coding the values of the database in your code, and then to when your application need a connection to the database, then dynamically at the runtime it create the connection to the database based on the requirement. So let me give you a small demo or overview of that one. So suppose this is our database. Okay, similarly let me design our application. For example, this is a WebLogic server. Okay, this is our WebLogic, where we have not WebLogic, let me give it traditional. Okay, this is our traditional application. Okay, and now suppose that this traditional application need to connect to your database when your users are connecting to your applications. Okay, so here in the traditional application you have to do lot of different kind of a codings. Okay, if it is a Java based application, you have to do this coding in the Java application. Similarly, if you have some different other applications in which you are developing your application, some other language, you have to do a lot of codings in your application. Okay, and whenever any client is going to be connected to your application which need a connection to your database, so at that time your this code, your application code is going to create a connection, okay, to the database. So this is at the runtime. That means when your client need a connection to your application which need to interact with your database, at that time it is going to connect with the database to reserve a connection for the communication. Okay, so this is a kind of a overhead because your application is connecting to your database and creating the connection at the runtime when your clients are connected to your applications and they are waiting to get the connections. And at that time, your application is trying to get the connection from the database. It's a performance overhead. Okay, you may get a lot of performance issues in that case. So now what is the alternate of that one? The alternate is your data source, which is a part of your WebLogic and along with some other enterprise application servers as well. Okay, the concept is same. So now what will happen in case of a data source? Let me replace it with the WebLogic. Suppose this is a WebLogic. Okay, so in the WebLogic we can do the configurations of the data source. Okay, now what exactly is this data source that we are configuring? Okay, this is a ready to use connections from the database. That means when you start your WebLogic server, okay, it automatically create the connections to the database and it reserve that connection at the data source level based on the configuration that we defined. I will tell you that what are the parameters that we defined in the data source for this kind of a connections. Okay, so for example, you consider there is a value of 20. That means I need a 20 connection to be always there in my data source. That means 20 ready to use connections. So what will happen when your WebLogic server is up and running and your data source is deployed to your application, targeted to your application? Okay, it will maintain 20 connections always. That means 20 ready to use connections. That means these connections are already established with your database. For example, this is connection 1. Similarly, you have a connection 2. Similarly, you have a connection 3. Similarly, you have a connection 4. Similarly, you have a 20 connections that will be always connected to your database and available in your data source. So now what will happen in that case? For example, you have an application which we have deployed on your WebLogic server, and that application need a connection to the database. Now this is your application, okay, and this application need a connection to the database. So what will happen? This application is going to connect to your data source, right, to get the connection. right? And here we have a 20 connections already established with the database. That means they are ready to use connections. They are already established. So your application will immediately get the connection from the data source and serve to the client. So what will happen if we compare it to the traditional way of connecting to the database? We don't have any hard coded values of the data source. That means we are not going to create the connection at the runtime. Okay, this is completely dynamic, and then your connections are already established with the database, so you will get a good performance, optimal performance in that case, because your application is taking the connections from a pool which is called the connection pool, right? When we define the data source, inside that we have a property that is called connection pool. So why it called as a pool? Because this is a ready to use connections to the database. So now we have idea what exactly is a data source, or what exactly is a connection pool, which is a pool of connections, or you can say pool of ready to use connections, which is already established with your database, which increase the performance of your application, because your application has not to wait to create the connection to the database when required, right? So this is the definition of your data source and connection pool, right? So now let us talk about few important properties of your data source, or how we create the connections, or how we maintain the connections in your data source. Okay, so let me go to the official documentation. So this is the different parameters that we define in our data source. So these are certain basic configurations that we define. Like for example, when we need to connect to a data source, we have to provide the database host name, and then URL, complete URL, your host IP or DNS, then properties like you have a database password, username. So all these are some basic parameters. And apart from that, if we talk about the capacity of the connections, there are three important parameters here. We have initial capacity, we have maximum capacity, we have a minimum capacity. Now what exactly is this initial capacity, what is maximum capacity, and what is minimum capacity? Okay, these are very important in terms of your connection to the database and for your application performance. So let me give you clarity with the diagram. Okay, I will create a diagram to give you clarity on all these three parameters. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind, whatever the parameters for the connection pool that you are going to configure at your application server or data source level, you have to make sure these number of connections are available, or your database is able to create such number of connections. You can't blindly define any number of connections here. Okay, because there are multiple pros and cons of the configurations that you are going to define here. For example, if your DB doesn't have a capacity to support the more than 200 connections, okay, and here if you are defining the connections as 200, or maybe you are defining 250, then you will get a problem with the data source, because your database doesn't have a capacity to create the 250 connections, right? So but you have to ensure that whatever the connection properties that you are going to define here, okay, your database is also able to create such number of connections. So for that, you may have a database expertise, or you may consult with the database administrator. So we have two different parameters here, processes and sessions. Okay, so these two important parameters, specifically I'm talking about the Oracle database, a deal with the number of connections that can be created from your application server. Okay, so for that you can deal with the database administration. You don't need to worry about that one if you are a WebLogic admin. Okay, you have to only ensure that what is the total number of connections that is required for your application, and before defining that, you can check with the DB admin if your database is supporting such number of connections or not, right? So now how to identify the number of connections, and then what is the meaning of initial, maximum and minimum connection pool capacity. So let me quickly define a small basic architecture. This is our WebLogic server. Okay, so I am defining a basic architecture for the understanding. Okay, so there in a professional environment, you can have a multiple parallel application servers, right, for the high availability purpose. So just for your understanding, to give you understanding on this particular concept, okay, I am going with a single instance. Okay, suppose this is your WebLogic, where we have configured data source, and then where we have a connection pool configuration inside your data source. Okay, for which we have to define the initial and minimum and maximum capacity of your connection pool, right? So these are the three important parameters that we have to define inside your connection pool. So now what will happen, how we can define, and what is the purpose of all these parameters? For example, let me take the database as well. So this is my backend database, and this application server is going to connect to this particular database for the connections. Right. So now what will happen when you configure the initial capacity? Okay, it is named saying that initial capacity. Okay, so this is the capacity, or you can say the number of connections that will be created when you are going to start your application server, or you can say when you are going to start your managed server in which you have targeted your data source. Now, for example, if you have defined the initial capacity as 20. Okay, so what will happen if you have defined the 20? When you are going to start your managed server, during the startup of your managed server, your application server will connect with the database to check if it is available or not, because you have a data source which is going to connect to this DB, and you have defined the initial capacity, okay, as 20. Right, so let me mark it here. Let me change the color of this box. Okay, let me give you some good color here. Okay, yeah, let me take it. And now let me define this with yellow. Okay, so now initial capacity is 20. So when you are starting your managed server, at that time, when your server is getting started startup phase, it will connect to DB and it will try to create the 20 connections. And why it is defining 20 connections? Because we have given the initial capacity as 20. And depend on the architecture of your applications, many of your applications may need to connect to your database, which need the connections, right? So we define the initial capacity, or you can say it is a bare minimum capacity that we have to identify, that we need to make sure that it has to be created at the startup of your WebLogic server. If suppose that you have defined the initial capacity as 20 and this database server is not available when you are starting your managed server, so what will happen? Your managed server will keep trying your database, because you have an initial capacity of 20. That means your database is down, and WebLogic server will keep try to create the 20 number of connections to the database when it is starting. And if it is not able to create due to unavailability, then maybe your server will come up, but your data source status will be failed, not available. Or maybe if your some of the application has a dependency on the database, which really required at the startup, right? You may have a certain applications for which metadata is stored in a database. That means certain important configurations that is required by your application to be up and running. If database is not available and your application is not able to create the connection pool, you are not able to reserve the initial connections, okay, then there would be a chance that your managed server will not come up, because your application will not get the proper metadata configurations that is required for the startup. Right. So depend on your application, there would be a different kind of a behavior. Maybe server will come up, but your data source will not available, or maybe your managed server will get fail if your application need the connection with the database at the startup of time. Right. So this is the initial capacity that we defined, and this is applicable during the startup of your managed server. Right. Now second is minimum capacity. So once your server is started, so let me show you the definition here as well. This is the initial capacity, and you see here the number of physical connections to create when creating the connections pool in the data source. If unable to create this number of connections, creation of data source will fail. That means the number of physical connection to create when creating the connection pool in the data source. So at what time we create the connection in the data source? When we start the managed servers, right? So that means when you are starting the managed server, it will going to create the number of connection to the database as we defined in the initial capacity. Right. So now second is the minimum capacity. Now minimum capacity is the number of connections that will be always available in your data source. Right. So now before that, let me tell you, when we say that data source contain the ready to use connections, that means those connections are already established with the database and available in your pool. That means all those connections are reserving the resources, right? Because they are already established connection. So for example, if you have a 50 connections are reserved, okay, that means if we have a 50 connections are already reserved at the database using data source, there would be possibility that 50 threads are already held by your application server, right? Because they are ready to use connections, they has been established with the database and ready to pick up. So there could be a chance that if we have the capacity we have defined as 50, then which 50 threads are consumed at the WebLogic server level. Now irrespective of the uses, whether your application using those 50 connection or not at a particular moment of a time, it will always get reserved because we have defined this particular capacity, right? And similarly, because the connections has already been established with the database, so all these established connection will going to take the resources of your database as well. So that means minimum capacity is the number of connections that will always reserve in your data source. That means 50. If I have defined the 50, that means 50 connections will always available in your connection pool, or you can say 50 ready to use connection will always reserve in your database, in your data source connection pool, and all these 50 going to take the resources of your WebLogic server. It is going to take the resources of your database because they are already established connection. So the kind of a capacity we have to define. What is the minimum number of capacity that our application always use. Okay, for example, out of 24 hours in a day, maybe chance that for 23 hours the application use around 40 to 50 connections, and for only 1 hour of duration the users may go high, somewhere around 60 or 70 or 80, right? So that means I know that out of it in 24 hours a day, 23 hours I need my only 50 connections in for my applications. Okay, so that is the optimum value, okay, that we can define for the minimum capacity. Now if you are saying that for the rest of the 1 hour our utilization will go 60, 70 or maybe 80 or more than that one, right? Because in that particular 1 hour of a time we may be facing a peak load in our system at a particular hour. So what we can define the maximum capacity as 80. For example, if you are expecting that somewhere around 70 or 75 connections expecting at the maximum load time, so we can define the maximum capacity of 80, right? So what will happen for rest of the 23 hours our application will use ready to use connection, and anytime if your application need the connection more than that, well, it will borrow from the maximum capacity. Okay, after that, if the 50 connections are all utilized, which is defined in the minimum capacity, and your application need more connections, that means more than 50, then it will take it from the maximum capacity. Okay, that means these connections will be created from the database. Okay, to cater the peak demand. Right. So now, in nutshell, initial capacity is the capacity that is used at the startup of your WebLogic server. The number of connections that is going to be created at the startup of time of your WebLogic server. Minimum capacity are the number of ready-to-use connections that will always available in your database, irrespective of the utilization. It could be chance that you have defined 50, but your applications are only using 20. But you have a rest 30 of the ready-to-use connections in your pool, which is just consuming your WebLogic resources, which is just consuming your database resources, because you have defined the capacity as 50, right? And if you have defined the maximum capacity of 80, that means your application at a peak load of a time can create maximum 80 number of connections to the database. If suppose that you are at a particular moment your application is demanding 81 connections or 82 connections or any count which is more than 80, okay, then you will get pool is out of resource exception in your log file, because it will reach to the maximum capacity of 80. Okay, and now the generic recommendation, when we talk about the generic recommendation for the tuning, okay, that is the minimum capacity should be equal to maximum capacity. Okay, for example, if we are expecting the 80 number of connections in our connection pool, okay, what we need to do, we can define the 80 number of minimum capacity as well, because we know that applications are going to use 80 connections and we don't know at what time they will going to use the 80 connections in a day, right? So what will happen, we can define both the capacity as 80, so that all the connections will be considered as a ready to use connection. That means all the connections, 80 connections, will be the ready to use connections always. You don't need to, then your application don't need to go to the maximum capacity, okay, if it is reached to the minimum capacity, right? So this is a generic recommendation, but again this may not be true for your environment. So as I said, as I discussed about the multiple cases, if you are going to define the 80 and out of 24 hours your the 23 hours your applications are only has a requirement of 40 connections, okay, so and you are defining the minimum capacity at 80, that means rest of the 80 connections are always consuming your resources at the database, at the WebLogic as well, okay, which is not the expected. So these are the certain use cases where we can tune these initial minimum and maximum capacity parameters, and what exactly is the data source and how we define the connections. Now let me talk about a few more properties. Okay, so I will have a multiple sessions on this where we are going to cover some other topics as well. So other important properties are test connection on reserve. So what happens is that, for example, what I said, this is a ready to use connections, right? For example, I have defined the minimum capacity of 80. That means 80 ready to use connections are already available. So that means when I define minimum capacity of 80, my server startup, and after that it connected to the database. Okay, and it created a 80 connections, right? For example, in the morning 8:30 a.m. Okay, it has created the minimum capacity of 80. It has checked that the 80 connections are healthy and available. Okay, so now there could be a possibility that it was tested at 8:30, right? And there could be a problem in your database at 8:31 a.m. right? So what will happen in this case? Because 8:30 you have created 80 connections, those has been marked as ready to use connections, but now in the backend after 1 minute your database went down. So that means some of your connections or many of your connections may not be valid at that particular moment. So there could be a chance that you have a multiple backend application servers for the high availability purpose. Okay, and any of the backend server get crashed. Okay, so your connection which has been pooled in your connection pool may not be valid, right? So what will happen? You need to define a mechanism by which your data source will check for the connection which is defined in your connection pool if they are valid or not, right? And it has to keep only the valid connections in your connection pool. To avoid this kind of a situation, you have test connection on reserve. So this enable WebLogic server to test a connection before it to a client. So that means whenever a client need a connection from the connection pool, okay, before giving it to the client, your connection data source will check if that connection is active or not. Okay, it will test whether the connection is valid or not. For that you need to enable the test connection on reserve parameter. Okay, and this is the test frequency. So now as I said, your initial connection has been created at 8:30 and 8:31 your data server get crashed, right? So that means whatever the number of connections that has been established in your connection pool, okay, after that you need a frequency in which your database get pulled by your connection pool in a certain period to check whether the database is available or not, right? And if found the database is not available, then it will remove the stale connection from your connection pool, right? So this is called the test frequency. At what frequency you want your connection data source to be check the availability of your database, and that you can define with the help of test frequency. Okay, that means the number of seconds a WebLogic server instance wait between attempt when testing unused connection. That means whatever the unused connection that you have in your connection pool, that need to be tested, okay, whether they are valid or not, by testing if the connection to the database is successful or not, right? This is the test frequency, and you have to define a test table name. When your WebLogic is going to be connected to your database to check whether the connection is valid or not, so it will, you need a table name, okay, and maybe a query. Okay, you can go with the default query that comes with by default with the bundle WebLogic. Okay, you just enable the connection parameter. It will automatically take a default table name. Okay, and it will query that table at the runtime to check whether the database is available or not. So these are the three other important parameters of your data source, right? And one more important parameter which is called the inactive connection timeout. So what exactly is an inactive connection timeout? Multiple time it has happened that there would be a leak in your application. Leak in your application means what I said initially. We have an application which is deployed on our WebLogic. Okay, and this application need a connection from your data source, right? So let me mark it as well. This is my application which is going to utilize a connection, okay, from the connection pool, right? So whenever an application need a connection from the connection pool, and once the use of connection is over, this application has to return that connection to your connection pool. It will not always create a lock on the connection pool, otherwise it will not be available for the other application or other request. So suppose an application need a connection with a database to fetch some data. This application will connect to connection pool. From here it will take one connection, it will reach to database, the data will return to your application, and then that application return that connection pool, the connection pool. That transaction is over. Now multiple time it has happened that you define a bad application which take the connection from the connection pool, but it not return it back to the connection pool when the use is over. In that case there is a connection leak happened. Okay, that means the connection is taken from the pool but is not returned to your connection pool. So what will happen in that case? If we have defined the initial the capacity as 80, maximum capacity is 80, and if the connections are not getting returned to this pool, so when the 80 connections are utilized by your application, then your capacity will be exhausted because the application connection has not been returned to your connection pool. So your application will be connection will be exhausted, and you will get the problem or error, the no capacity is available. And you may think about that, okay, my application is completely using all the connection pools and I have to go to increase the capacity. No, in that case you have to tune your application. Okay, you have to tune your code to close the connection which is utilized but not getting returned back to your application. That is called the connection leak. Okay, so I will show you in the next session as well. You can go to the WebLogic console, click on your data source tab and go to monitoring, and there you have multiple tabs: active connection high count, current connection high count, and then you can enable one more parameter there, the leak connection count. Okay, so if you seeing the any number of leak connection count, that means you have some problem in your code or in your WebLogic server. There could be some other problems as well which is causing the connection leaking. Okay, so to deal with that situation, if you have that situation, you can define the inactive connection timeout. So what will happen? Suppose if you have defined the inactive connection timeout at 60. Okay, so if any connection is active for more than 60 seconds, it will automatically return to the pool. Okay, this is a parameter that we use to deal with the connection leak. But again, it has a very different kind of impact that we are going to cover in other session, because multiple time it is happened that when we have a long sessions are running in the database or long queries are executing, okay, that will may feel like it is an inactive connection. The queries are still running in the backend database, but the connection may be active. And if you have defined this setting as 60 seconds, okay, the connection will get invalidated even though the query is running in the backend in the database. So it has an adverse impact as well. Okay, so this is one of the important parameters. For that you have to do a lot of brainstorming, okay, with respect to your application and the utilization of your connection pool or connections before defining this setting. So these are the certain important parameters, and this is about all about the data source, the use of data source, and then the different important parameters of your data source. Thank you.